We researched the colonization of Algeria by France, and this is by Beatty, Caroline, and Cliffy.
This is a primary source painting which shows the fly whisk incident that occurred in 1827. This was when Hussein Dey, who was the leader of Algeria at the time, met with the French. He wanted the French to repay a 28-year-old debt that they owed to merchants who in turn owed the Dey, but they wouldn't pay the Dey until the French paid them. The French, of course, disagreed, and Dey hit Pierre de Val, the French consul, with his fly whisk, which then set a chain of events in motion. The French created a blockade around Algeria in response, and when a French embassy was later shelled by force in Algeria, the French went to war against the Dey. The French defeated the Dey, and then they looked at Algeria as needing protection because they didn't have a leader. So they took control of the Algerian protectorate, which shows white man's burden.
Julie Francois Camille Ferry's speech before the French Chamber of Deputies took place on March 28, 1884. In this speech, he explains that the French believe it is their burden, also known as the white man's burden, to colonize and educate people of what they believe to be lesser. And this was their justification to colonize Algeria.
And at the bottom is a quote by Alexis de Tocqueville. He said that it is for their part that civilization is situated, meaning that it is for the Algerians that the French colonized them, which shows white man's burden. And then on the left, we have a map of Algeria, and it shows kind of how Algeria was slowly taken over as time went on, and it wasn't until 1956 that the French took over all of Algeria. They took over through military force, and we see on this map at Sidi Frej on the coast of Algeria, this was where the French invasion occurred. On the map to the right, we see how close Algeria is to France, which made it very easy for the France to take over Algeria and control. And it also opened up many ports and many new trade opportunities in the Mediterranean, as well as trans-Saharan trade. Throughout French rule, Algeria was under a military administration run by a governor-general of Algeria. A French settler population, known as the colons, grew and made up 1/10 of the population. The colons were the ruling minority of the Algerian populations and sent delegates to the French parliament. Most Algerians, not including the colons, were under the rule of military officers organized into Arab bureaus, and French rule can be considered despotic and military rule.
This poster, made in 1961, reads, "Independence, Integrity of Algeria, against the fascism, and commit for the peace in Algeria." The Algerian War took place from 1954 to 1962. In this poster, and the war shows the native Algerians' negative attitudes towards the French rule and their desire to govern themselves. The other photograph, taken around the start of the war, 1954, shows an unsmiling group of Algerians who had been caught by French soldiers after they had taken part in a revolt against the French rule.
Algeria has the 10th largest natural oil reserve in the world, so the production of oil was one of the main reasons for the French exploitation of Algeria. The production of oil began when the French gained influence and control in Algeria. France also took advantage of the agricultural opportunities in the colony that was lacking in France. France's GDP tripled from 1820 to 1913 when they colonized Algeria and took all the profits from the resources. Algeria's wealth increased in the 1970s when they gained independence and they were able to keep the benefits of the oil reserves and the agriculture.
Okay. This is a primary source from the book A Savage War for Peace, written by Alistair Horn, which shows how Muslims in Algeria were unfairly taxed. Their income was much less than the Europeans living in the area, and the taxes took a lot more money out of their income than it did of that of the wealthy Europeans. This shows how the Europeans took advantage of the Algerians by greatly taxing them in order to create a profit back in France. Also, the Europeans in Algeria were paying less taxes than they would if they were in France, which again shows how the Europeans took advantage of Algeria to turn a profit. And then these graphs show France's exports of wine. Algeria was a major part of France's wine industry. They set up many vineyards in Algeria, and it shows on the graph on the left, it shows how from 1892 to 1964, most of the wine in the world was coming from Algeria. This ended in 1964 because Algeria gained their independence in 1962, and France stopped working their wine in Algeria. And then on the graph on the right, it shows France's exports of wine, and we see how it dropped majorly in 1962 because this is when Algeria gained their independence. We also see a drop in 1915 because of World War I and 1947 because of World War II. So this is another quote from Alistair Horn from A Savage War of Peace, and it explains how many Muslims from Algeria migrated to France because they found themselves jobless in Algeria, and they were looking for jobs in France.
And the quote under that explains how the native Algerians were unhappy with the French colonizing their land and being on their land, so the French became worried that they would revolt. The photograph and the painting, which is titled Arrival of Marshal Randon in Algiers, 1857, shows boats and water as a method of transportation to Algeria. The chart of average French immigration into foreign countries by decades, 1851 until 1925, shows that the most immigrants arrived from France to Algeria from the years 1851 to 1860, and some continuously arrived throughout the graph's span of time. The next two pictures show Algerians revolting in France and two Algerians surrounded by French people in their home country, Algeria. The photograph reveals how their religion became less of a culture and more of a minority in their own country. Césaire's 1955 book, Discourse on Colonialism, tells that in Algeria, projects were completed, illnesses cured, and some standards of living elevated, in the French's opinion. But in Algeria, after colonization, religion and culture suffered after French entered Algeria. Migration overall happened between the two countries, as the other picture shows 1961 Algerians revolting in central France.
From 1832 to 1847, there was resistance to French rule from native Algerians. A primary leader in the revolts was Abdelkader. He used similarity in the tribal religions along with military force to combat the French invasion. In 1837, he and General Thomas Roubar-Bigot of France signed the Treaty of Tafna, an agreement that was developed after France's heavy losses from the resistance. This allowed Abdelkader to control two-thirds of Algeria. He built new cities away from the French and consolidated the tribes to motivate the Algerians under French rule to resist the invasion, creating a new state. Although he was defeated in 1847, the now unified state of Algeria allowed for Algeria and France to have a long-lasting divide. This picture depicts the invasion of France in 1830, an extreme military advance, and the native Algerians are pictured on the land.